looking at the different colonies as they emerge in the mid 1600s is an important way for us to think about the sort of different nature that's going to be popping up throughout the colonies in the mid 17th century. So one of the earlier videos, right, looked at sort of the different nature of the colonies, sort of the colonial experiences of the southern colonies, South Carolina, well, the Carolinas and Virginia, the middle state, or in Maryland there, right, the mid-Atlantic colonies, right, New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware, and then sort of the New England colonies. Today we're going to be taking a bit of a deeper dive and looking at sort of the internal complexities of each of those places, right? One of the things, and we're going to start with the southern colonies, so I'll start there, right? One of the big changes or one of the big pieces to note is there, right, is this tobacco monoculture, right? Tobacco in this period was the dominant industry in places like Virginia. And, you know, a place like North and South Carolina or the Carolinas, right, means that they were a cash crop commodity. They were a cash crop. They were cash crop colonies, right? So they had a very dominant slave population because of the extensive need for there to be production, right? So they produced rice, Carolina rice. They produced some tobacco, more in the northern regions. Indigo, right? Some really important commodities, lucrative commodities. Now, they imported a slave code in the 1660s, right, in order to adopt and protect, quote unquote, the white population, right? And it was a way to ensure and enforce rules that made the slaves, you know, have to be very concerned about their lives, right? It made slavery a hereditary institution that passed from mother to child. It was an institution based solely on the color of a person's skin, not on anything else. And it made it what we call today a closed institution, an institution where once a person was within it, there was really no way to get out of it. And as you look further north, right, in a place like New York, right? New York becomes a royal colony in the 1660s when it is acquired from the Dutch. And what happens as a result is you have massive amounts of shipping going on. This becomes a very lucrative colony, right, because of the port. New York Harbor is still today in the 21st century and was in the 1600s and 1700s one of the most, if not the most, the best ports in the world, harbors in the world. But as you look at other colonies, right, particularly Pennsylvania and Delaware, these colonies are, and this is true as well for New York, these are very diverse colonies, right? In the South, in the Carolinas and Virginia, those colonies are pretty much exclusively English if you're white, or I should say British if you're white, and African slave if you are black, right? And now, when we talk about African slaves, right, this will come up again, but knowing specifically sort of what part of Africa slaves came from is very difficult, certainly now, 400, 500 years later. And that's really one of the many, but one of the big and one of the most awful pieces of slavery is that people are stripped of their identity, right? We don't know where a lot of these slaves came from, or pretty much all these slaves came from, right? Which coast of Africa, or what portion of the western coast, or if they came from the east coast of Africa. But when you look at other colonies, right? If you look at colonies like Pennsylvania, New York, New Jersey, Delaware, these are typically pretty diverse colonies for a couple of reasons, right? One, they were so in a place like Pennsylvania, right? We call these the restoration colonies because these are colonies given to different families for their help of Charles II when he came back to the throne after the English Civil War in 1660. Now, William Penn gets land in Pennsylvania, names it Pennsylvania, and he declares an equality for men and women. But the other piece is it's religiously tolerant, right? And in a place like Britain, that was not religiously tolerant, right? The Civil War is a lot about sort of lack of religious toleration for Britain. Is important for us to understand, right? That that the religious toleration is a significant draw for these colonists. Also because it's very business oriented. So one of the things that's really interesting, I think, and you wouldn't notice this unless you really went to Philadelphia and spent some time, is that if you go to Philadelphia or any of the major cities in Pennsylvania established under the Penn family, like Carlisle, even Harrisburg, they're all on a grid pattern. Now, if you've ever traveled in Lower Manhattan, right, you know that Lower Manhattan is not, right? Up until about 14th Street, there are alleys and different streets that sort of jut in, curve, right? It's not a sort of straight or grid system until you get to about 14th Street. But in Philadelphia, Carlisle, and others, right, that's not the case. These towns and cities are on a grid pattern, even established in the 1600s, because they were all about business. They wanted to make sure that you could get around pretty easily. Anyway, these territories are, they have good representative governments, they are religiously tolerant, and it's important for us to see, right, that the societies that are being established here are one of more egalitarian nature. People have access to economic situations, right? There's no aristocracy here in the Americas, so that no one is too rich and no one is too poor. Now, one of the things that does start to sort of create a situation where people do get disgruntled is within the Chesapeake region. In the Chesapeake, one of the things that happens is indentured servants and indentured peoples are coming to the Americas, coming to the Carolinas and Virginia, and they are anticipating better treatment, better economic opportunity, right? They may not have had a lot of economic opportunity in Britain, but they come here for economic opportunity. And for the indentured servants, when they arrive, they are expecting a certain style of life. And then when they come here and do not have that, you start to have a cracks in that structure. So Nathaniel Bacon comes to Virginia in the 1660s, and the governor at the time, Governor Berkeley, is really very much in favor of the planter class and does not want to support the indentured servants. A revolution breaks out, or a rebellion breaks out among the indentured, sort of middling, what you might consider middling group of people, and about their treatment, about their economic opportunities. And this little rebellion highlights this sort of negative treatment of this really important farmer class, right? The people who are growing the tobacco on a daily basis, right? These rich planter classes they're folks who are just really reaping the benefits of this, and they are not, and those indentured servants are not. What happens after this is that there are small changes made, but again, nothing too significant. The colonial economy really ranged depending on where a person was, right? If a person lived in the middle colonies, it was really the breadbasket. You produced grain, you produced a lot of different very important grains. Rye was important, wheat, corn. These were all substantial products that needed to be, obviously help feed the people who were living here. But even, again, as we get closer to to the American Revolution in the 1770s and 80s, it's one of the things that's going to make people understand that, we Americans, we colonials, are really important to the British, right? Without us, they could not survive. So it's important for people to understand, right, that this is part of what people are experiencing. The other piece to this, right, is that, and in the southern colonies, right, you have this fertile soil that's producing a lot of tobacco and a lot of other goods, a lot of indigo and rice. But the problem is that land towards the coast is owned by a lot of the wealthy families. And for a poor farmer, a newly freed indentured servant, they could not afford land near the coast. So they were forced to go inland. So you have fights with the Native Americans occurring. So there's going to be a war called King Philip's War in the late 1600s, where in King Philip's War, Native Americans are going to fight against colonials who are moving too far west and encroaching on Native American land. And that's going to create hostilities, obviously against the European settlers and the Native Americans, but it's also going to create tensions among those indentured classes, and that same Bacon rebellions problem, right, where the planter class gets all of these rights, all of this land, all of this territory, and the poor farmers have to move progressively and further inland. Where is our protection? Where do we get the rights that we are entitled to? So this slave culture, this slave society that is beginning to emerge in the South is really favoring that rich that rich planter class. And all of this comes to the idea of mercantilism. When we look at the southern colonies or the northern colonies, the southern colonies, the mid-Atlantic colonies, or the New England colonies, the problems that are emerging here are all due to these ideas of mercantilism. So mercantilism is an economic idea where basically it works on the idea of the more gold you have, the richer you are, because if you have X amount of gold, your enemy can't have your gold. So basically the idea here is I need to sell more than I buy. So because if I can sell more, then if I can get more money than I have to give back out, I can be richer. And as a result of that, colonies are going to have their rights stripped from them, because for the British, it's all about getting more money, getting the most amount of money possible. And they're going to seek cheap raw materials. They're going to seek tobacco and rice and sugar and timber and fish, all of these, and wheat and grains from the colonies in order to ensure that they can get more gold than they have to give back out. Again, this comes up to the idea of salutary neglect. As long as manufactured goods and raw materials and all of these other products keep coming from the colonies to Britain, that's all that mattered. Now, I don't necessarily like the term salutary neglect. I'm not entirely sure that it's neglect, but nonetheless, this is the term that we use to describe it. So when we look at the colonies in the 16 and into the 1700s, right, the economic conditions under which they are living creates the situations in which creates their economic situations, right? For the South, the tobacco monoculture, the introduction of slavery, creates a system where slaves are a necessary evil. The poor farmers are going to be treated as awful, in awful conditions, and the planters are going to be treated very nicely. But then you have, in Pennsylvania, right, the sort of lack of that type of commodity or lifestyle leads to the development of more equitable situations, religious freedom and religious toleration. The same is true for New York.